Okay, great. Thanks. That looks good to me. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for Recovering from Ransomware, Lessons from Real Recoveries. My name is James. I'll start today with a couple of bits of housekeeping just to kick us off. So we're scheduled today for 30 minutes. If you have any questions, you're able to type those in on the right-hand side in your GoToWebinar panel. Thank you to those of you who have already submitted some questions when you registered. We're going to try to cover those ones off as we go through. And to answer the first question that we got, we are recording the session today. We will also be distributing the slides afterwards. So once we've pulled this all together, we'll pop that out to everybody either later this afternoon or tomorrow. So don't feel you need to furiously scribble anything down or kind of take note of any of the diagrams that we're going to show that hopefully will be useful to you all. So what are we going to be talking about today? Ransomware, obviously super hot topic. It's something that we talk an awful lot about. I know we have people on this webinar who are both Data Barracks customers and people who aren't Data Barracks customers. If you are customers, you'll know it's something that we tend to bring up an awful lot in all of our newsletters. It's something that we know is a very significant, serious issue, and we see an awful lot more of it perhaps than other people do. So we want to make sure that we're informing everyone about that. So we're going to talk about the state of ransomware at the moment, what the current threats are, what's been changing, and what are the things that we need to be particularly careful about. We're going to look at how to prevent backups themselves from being encrypted along with production data. We're going to take a look at what it's really like to deal with a ransomware instance, so some of the people-centric processes around this, and then how to bring your systems back online safely without risking reinfection. And we're going to share some of the stories that we've had this year through what has been our busiest ransomware year ever. We've had lots and lots of recoveries, and there's been some changes in the way that both the way that we've approached that and also the kinds of attacks and the way that we need to respond to them. So to start with, a little bit of kind of context and background to where we are and what kind of the magnitude of the issue is. We carry out an annual survey. We've been doing so since 2008, called the Data Health Check, and we ask 400 IT professionals in the UK lots of questions about things like data protection, cybersecurity, kind of all the things that you probably expect from Data Barracks, from someone like us. And one of the things that's a question that has been in there since the start is, what have been the major causes of data loss for you? And it's always an interesting one when we look back over it, because it really doesn't change an awful lot. Issues like human error and hardware failure always tend to be the most common causes of data loss. Those things don't really change, and they fluctuate a little bit year to year, but there's no real trend in them going up or going down. It's not getting better or any worse. The one cause of data loss that does have a very significant trend is cyber attacks. So back in 2008, they were sort of less than 5% of people were reporting them as a cause of data loss. This year, it's far more than that. I think we're almost at 25%, and it's on this trajectory. It's likely to be the most common cause of data loss. And of those causes, the one that has shot up very rapidly is ransomware. So the first time we actually started asking a question to our respondents about ransomware was in 2016, which is an interesting date, and I'll come back to it probably a couple of times later on. But in 2016, only 9%, so less than 10% of people had been affected by a ransomware incident that year. Last year, it was 29%. And I've seen other surveys where that figure is much, much higher. We know it's always a very difficult one. I think ransomware is quite an emotive topic. It's not something that necessarily everyone is particularly keen to admit to. But certainly, the thing that I think we're always really, really keen to stress is we see a lot of the really, really big attacks in the news. It gets covered in the IT press. It gets covered potentially even in the kind of the national news. But the thing that we see kind of behind the scenes is there's far, far more attacks that do go on. Lots of organizations that are recovering, and lots and lots that never make the headlines. I think probably of all the attacks that we've recovered this year, perhaps only 2 of them we've ever seen actually being announced in the press. Quite often, organizations are able to kind of deal with it behind the scenes because they're perhaps not in a a particularly public-facing industry. But anyway, it's a very significant issue, and it's something that has been growing very, very rapidly. Now, let's come back to what I mentioned a second ago of 2016. I want to go back a little bit to then. So we held our first ransomware webinars in 2016, and that was the point when, for us, it was really becoming an issue that we felt we needed to kind of communicate about. It was something that people were interested in, and we were dealing with a lot of recoveries. Now, that was just before it really shifted in the public consciousness with WannaCry and, of course, NotPetya in 2017. And I think that made a really big difference. It, obviously affected the NHS. It was all over the news, and probably you all experienced this, where it went from being something that the IT department knew all about to something that the wider business probably were starting to ask questions about. But for us, back in 2016, the kinds of attacks that we were dealing with were things like CryptoLocker. If you remember that one, I think by 2016, the decryptor had actually been released. But these were the kinds of attacks that were wide in their scale, and they were relatively low-cost ransoms. These were things where the attackers were looking to get thousands of people, and by people I do mean organizations and private individuals infected, because the ransom was only a few $100s. It wasn't a significant amount of money. Now, what's happened in the interim between 2016 and now is that ransomware as an industry has really kind of grown up. It's industrialized. Probably everyone has heard of ransomware as a service, where a would-be attacker doesn't need to develop ransomware themselves. You can go out and you can buy a kit, you can deploy that, and then that person then just pays a commission to the original developer of the ransomware. It's a business in the sense that they have division of labor. They've got developers. I think I saw an interesting article recently where a ransomware gang were hiring for a kind of multilingual negotiator. It's very much grown up altogether, and the result of that is that the kinds of attacks that we're now seeing are far more targeted, and these are the much higher ransoms. So the ransoms that we see in the papers about that are in the millions of dollars, and as a result, they're also far more sophisticated methods. With something like a CryptoLocker, it was really a kind of spray and pray approach. Blast it out, send out a phishing email to hundreds of thousands of people. A small percentage of those will click on the link, and a small percentage of those will be infected, and a small percentage of those will pay out. That's not what's going on now. We've got very targeted attacks and using methods like double extortion. So that means not only infecting the data with ransomware and encrypting the data, but also while you're there, exfiltrating data so that the attackers are able to threaten to release that. And that's obviously something that's become a more significant issue with GDPR, with the increased fines that come through personally identifiable information. But it's beyond that. There's kind of lots of other methods that they're now starting to use too. Obviously, trying to infect backups, something we'll talk about a lot. And then even just trying to outlast a backup retention policy. Make sure that the ransomware is on the network for long enough that you outlast any kind of backup retention that a customer might have. There are two ways to get out of a ransomware attack. One is to pay the ransom, one is to recover from backups. The attackers obviously know that too, so what they're trying to do is to put as much pressure on you as possible to cut off those other options to make sure that you need to pay. And then kind of lastly, and this is kind of a little bit of an aside, but I just wanted to mention kind of why we're in this situation and a couple of positive bits of news for hopefully things of why things might start to get better soon. So earlier this year, a ransomware task force was convened, and this was put together by a number of cybersecurity companies, some government bodies, people like the NCSC that we have in the UK, but others internationally. It was a large group, and they had a number of recommendations for how we needed to, really turn this tide, because it's been a really sharp uptick in ransomware and something that needed attention. And they had a number of recommendations, but three really key ones. The first was around cryptocurrency. So the reason that ransomware has really taken off, ransomware has been around for quite a while, but it wasn't really an issue until cryptocurrency came along, because it enabled attackers to be able to take a payment where they would not be able to be traced. So it gave them an element of an anonymity, and what as we're kind of trying to illustrate in this diagram here, but it shifted the scales in the risk-reward equation. Suddenly, the risk had really significantly dropped, and they were able to take advantage of that, which is what kind of gave it that kick. Now, the other problem that you get with ransomware is it's very much an international issue. In the vast majority of cases, the attackers aren't in the same territory as the people that they're attacking. Makes it very, very difficult to police. Obviously, with certain countries that have been turning a blind eye to attackers and allowing it to develop, that's what's pushed this. It's, obviously we can only address this as a kind of an international community in a joined up manner. Now that has started to change. We've seen action from a number of countries, but most significantly from the US earlier this year in their dealings with Russia. And then we've seen the impact very recently on the REvil or REvil gang that have been firstly kind of put out of business, and then secondly some arrests that have come from that. And then lastly, one of the causes, and this is something that we've certainly seen, one of the reasons that contributed to the growth in ransomware was that insurance companies were generally favoring paying out on a ransom rather than trying to encourage an organization to recover from their backups. Now, in isolation, that makes some sense. Potentially if you have a $1 million ransom payment, or you may end up with a claim for $10 or $20 million against business interruption insurance, it seems to make sense that you should pay that ransom instead. It's far lower the cost. But obviously, as we do this as a community, when you look at the entire system as a whole, favoring paying out just pushes criminals to force more attacks, and it's kind of fed into this vicious cycle of causing more and more attacks. Now, that has changed very quickly recently. Also, we've seen insurance companies making it more difficult to get cover, reducing the amount of cover they'll provide, and actually having far more stringent requirements on the organizations getting cyber insurance cover to make sure that organizations are in a position where they don't need to claim on that. It's very similar to kind of any other insurance that you might get. Your car premiums are much lower if you've got an immobilizer and a good locking system. So thankfully, I think all of these contributing factors that have made it such a major issue are starting to be addressed. Now, it's not to say this will go away immediately overnight, but hopefully what we're starting to see is the fight back and a bit of a turning of the tide. But all of these kind of macro functions that are occurring at the moment, that's not anything that we necessarily individually as organizations have any control over ourselves. So what are the things that we can do to protect ourselves from ransomware? And I'm going to run through this in two sections. I'm going to first look at, from a technology point of view, what are the things that we can do, and then secondly, the process and what it's like in an incident itself and how we recover from ransomware. So, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, in the US, if you know the organization, they have a cybersecurity framework, and that framework is identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And that covers kind of the full range of cybersecurity functions, and in this case, vendors. It's everything from your configuration management database of knowing what your infrastructure is all about, to your firewalls, defensive mechanisms, to your response, and then finally, your recovery, so your backup and replication. And I think that's a really good method to kind of view this from. Quite often we'll see a lot of vendors talk about having a kind of single solution for ransomware. It's absolutely not the case. It's a war that needs to be fought on multiple fronts. You certainly wouldn't try to protect yourself from ransomware without all of those things. But with that being said, the way that we approach backup and replication, so our part at the end, is also using this same method. So we use identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. When we look at backup and disaster recovery, so that means identifying your retention policies, protecting the backups themselves from being infected, and then using the technologies that you've got for backup and disaster recovery to detect, to respond, and then to be able to recover. So I'll start with identification. And the thing that has changed really significantly in the way that we approach ransomware is looking at our retention policies and how we protect data. And let me kind of illustrate this with a point. So the kind of traditional backup retention policy would be that you would take an overnight backup, you would keep that backup for every day for the week. So that might be 7 days for the week, or potentially 5 days if you're an office-based business. You'd keep the end of week backup for a month, and then you would keep your end of month backup for the year. So the positive thing about that as a retention policy is it was relatively minimal. Each of these folder icons would represent what, perhaps 20 years ago would have been a tape. Now we're talking about a single backup. The problem with that as a retention policy now, particularly for ransomware, is that beyond 7 days, your recovery point objective drops from 24 hours to an entire week. If you have a ransomware incident a week and a day ago, you're needing to recover from 2 weeks prior. And that's a lot of data to bring back. You're talking about a lot of data loss. If it's over a month, then obviously you're losing a month's worth of data. And this is a specific issue that we've seen. So this is one of the things that we've seen that's been far more common this year. We've had multiple instances where ransomware has been deliberately sitting dormant, waiting to outlast retention policies and to push beyond a month. Now, commonly when we talk about we have backup and we have replication schedules are generally much shorter. You're probably talking in some cases 3 days, in some cases 14 days or 30 days. That's what they're trying to evade. If you don't have a longer retention policy, then you're going to be caught out, and there's potentially a lot of data loss in those instances. Now, the flip side of that, this is obviously a bit of a legacy retention policy. It comes from the world of when we were backing up onto tapes and we were keeping them for a day. We don't need to do that anymore. We have got the technology to be able to do this far more frequently. So you could take the approach where you go, complete shock and awe on this. We're going to have multiple copies. We're going to do a 1 hour recovery point objective, and we're going to keep every copy for all day. We're going to keep every copy of those days for the week, for the month, for the year. Now, the problem with that as a policy is that obviously it has pretty explosive exponential growth for your storage. And not only the storage, the storage tends to be the sort of headliner on this because obviously the kind of cost is such a big factor. But on a kind of really practical sense, the reason that we generally don't set up very, very frequent backup or replication policies for some organizations is that the bandwidth is actually the constraint. So while you could kind of happily do that overnight and just push replication anytime, it hits a limit during the day when you've got other things going on. Now, the answer is obviously, as is always the case, is you need to find a happy medium. You need to be able to balance risk with cost with your recovery point. So that might be something like a 1 hour RPO for the day, 4 hours for the week, potentially 12 hours for the days, and a 24-hour recovery point objective for the year. And obviously that pushes storage up, but when you've got deduplication going on at the storage level, it keeps it in check over a longer period, particularly when you've got things like immutable storage policies, which we'll come on to now. So the next stage, as I kind of alluded to, is how do you protect your backup storage? Now, your production data now is probably living in a number of different places. I think it seems like the most common operating model for everyone is now a kind of a hybrid cloud model. So most of the organizations that we work with have some data that's on premises. They have some in some kind of productivity suite, so Office 365, Google Workspace, etc. And then some potentially in the public cloud too, so something in Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Azure. So that's kind of all of your data. And then you're protecting that and you're backing it up to somewhere else. Now, in this case, we're talking about Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud, or Amazon Web Services, because we're very much in favor of the public cloud as a method for backup and disaster recovery. But that could be anywhere. That could be between your own sites. It could be to a private data center somewhere, a colo facility, etc. So there are a few places here that we need to make sure your backups can't be affected by ransomware that has infected the production systems. So the first place that we start with that, the particular product that we recommend is Commvault. Some of these methods are available in other products. They're not unique to Commvault, but one of the things that Commvault does very, very well is it secures mount paths. So this is like having immutability as set by the backup software. And what that is it specifies that the only process that can affect and can change backup data on network attached and locally attached mount paths is Commvault itself. So that's you kind of locking down that kind of local storage. The next part of this is how you introduce an air gap into something that is effectively always on and connected. Now, traditionally, we would talk about an air gap backup as being a physically air gapped backup. You would have a backup on tape, and it was taken away separately. Now, as the vast majority of organizations are using either disk-based storage or cloud-based storage, we need to do that logically. So the first way that you do that is with network segregation. So in this case, it's a kind of pretty simple thing because we're sending those backups to somewhere else. So you're going to segregate how that works altogether. But something that folks often get caught out, particularly if you're backing up between your own sites, you need to make sure that your backups are never existing on the same network as your production data. The next stage on that is to make sure that your backup storage is always protected by multi-factor authentication. The reason that's important is that when you've had a ransomware attack, something that's been successful, your attacker has managed to infiltrate your network in some method. There's potential that they may be able to use something like a keylogger to be able to access even segregated systems. So even if you have completely different credentials to get access to your backup storage, there's potential they may find that. So something like a multi-factor authentication prevents them from being able to kind of leapfrog from that one place to the other. And then the last factor, and this is the one that is potentially being touted as a bit of a silver bullet, and in a lot of ways it is, and that's to set immutable storage at the storage level itself. So to have write once, read many storage. And that means once you've defined that policy at the storage level, nothing is able to alter or encrypt or even delete your data. Now, that's perfect. Obviously, it means that once you've kind of committed that backup, it's never going to change and you can always refer back to it. The only downside and the only factor that you need to kind of consider with that is that obviously it has an impact on your storage. Once you commit to that storage policy, to an extent, you're kind of stuck with it. So if you're committing to keeping X number of backups for X number of years, that will continue to increase. So it's a factor. Obviously, we kind of mentioned it prior with how retention policies affect storage. It's something that thankfully has become far less of an issue with the kind of rapidly decreasing cost of storage, but by no means it doesn't mean it's not a factor altogether. So something to think about. So the next stage is backup and disaster recovery software has a really kind of interesting place in your network, and it's really well positioned to help detect when a ransomware incident might happen. So there's a couple of things that Commvault does here, and there's methods that I know other products will do too. The first is to have honeypots, and that means particular files that exist on your network that are very closely monitored, and these are the kind of files that ransomware will typically encrypt first. And what that means is as soon as that's caught, you can then quickly alert and quickly kick off your response. Now, the other method that's used by Commvault in this case is it's a file activity anomaly search. So it's using machine learning that monitors your storage and learns what is a normal amount of data change for you. If it sees any unusual file system behavior, then it immediately kicks off some kind of alert. And then the thing that is important to do from here is how you can take the alert and that detection and quickly turn that into your response. So there's a particular feature that is most useful here, and that is to be able to trigger a workflow and an orchestration action. Now, I've seen some vendors talk about going very, very quickly from detection to recovery. That I think is not the right route. As we'll talk through, there are some stages that you want to go through before getting to recovery, but certainly what you want to do once you've detected some kind of anomaly is isolate that system as quickly as possible. So here we can have a file activity and anomaly alert email that immediately pings and have a clickable link that will immediately disconnect that particular system from the rest of the network. And now, to give an example from a couple of incidents that we've had, that can make the difference from a major ransomware recovery that will take several days or weeks versus we've had some smaller incidents where the detection's been very, very quick, that you can recover a system in hours. We've genuinely had recoveries where a portion of the organization wasn't even aware there was an issue going on, and that system gets brought back online, within the day. So, accelerating your detection and response as much as possible really kind of improves your recovery because you're limiting how much work that you need to do at that stage. And then lastly, kind of features that are really important from a technology point of view for how you can improve that recovery. Things like isolating suspected files. But the big one, the one that's really important to us, is having the ability to recover across cloud or across hypervisor. And the reason that's very important is ransomware recoveries tend to be very, very difficult. They tend to be fraught with issues, and we've had multiple cases where a customer wasn't able to recover to their preferred location. To give it kind of a very specific example, in one case, a customer was very keen to recover their data back onto their on-premises production infrastructure, but that infrastructure was being checked by the forensic team who were investigating it, so they weren't able to use it. They needed to recover into the cloud. So having that ability that actually gives you some flexibility is kind of super important. So to move away from the kind of the technology side to it, and actually now look at what it's like dealing with the kind of the real life part of a ransomware incident. And I think it's hard to overstate how significant ransomware recoveries are. They're very different from the kinds of recoveries that we personally been dealing with for a number of years. We used to look at a big recovery as being something that might take 24 or 48 hours. A ransomware recovery quite often won't even kick off at that point. There's so much that needs to go on before you can actually step to the point of recovering data, and it usually carries on for a number of weeks. And one of the reasons for that is that there's an enormous number of demands on the IT team to be able to recover this issue. So firstly, you've got to deal with your insurance company. They are potentially going to bring in a cyber forensic and response team, potentially also with a ransomware negotiator. Beyond that, you're likely to have to deal with the police. Although, as we said, it's often the case that they're not able to take enormous action on this because of the international nature of the crime. You've got your internal functions to deal with. So you're likely to have a PR team who are trying to deal with the public fallout. You've got all of your internal users, management, and the board of the company. And then lastly, you've got the regulators. So as we mentioned with GDPR, if there's a personal identifiable information breach, they need to be notified within 72 hours. And the more that you can give them earlier, the more lenient they're likely to be with any kind of potential fine that happens later on. And the issue is you've got an IT team that are being pulled in multiple different directions by all of these different people. And yes, there are other functions that can help, but something's got to come through IT at this point. So it's very, very difficult. So, our recommendations for how you deal with that recovery whilst also kind of juggling all of this is that firstly, it needs a full recovery team. It's not one person that's ever going to be able to manage to do that recovery on their own. We typically would have the kind of the account manager of the customer, the person who knows their systems best leading that recovery, but they'll be supported by a number of other people to help the recovery to do things in concert all at the same time. And we'll obviously, we bring in all of our kind of senior technical staff, the people that have dealt with ransomware incidents a number of times, because how to work through this process, you can really kind of speed up that recovery. The first thing that you end up doing when you've had an incident is once everything has been isolated, once you've made sure that the issue isn't spreading beyond where it's been contained, you're looking for your most clean recovery points. As we mentioned, that might come from your backup software. We've got flags that will pop up in Commvault. That might be something that's flagged by your cyber forensic team. It might be something that gets caught in a different system. But you don't immediately want to go to recovery from that point. What we would like to do at this point is to do some sandbox recoveries, bring that data back, test it at that point, run some AV scans, make sure that it absolutely is clean before we carry out the kind of the full recovery and bring everything back. During this point, during this whole process, there are going to be multiple crisis management team calls working throughout the process. And by crisis management team, I mean all of the sub teams that work that. You've got your recovery team, you've got your full crisis management team, you're likely to have your PR team, and as depending on kind of your role, whether you're very senior in the IT department and sitting in all of those sessions, or if you're someone who's doing the work and is involved in that. For us, typically we're doing kind of hourly crisis management calls, doing updates on where the recovery is. Sometimes at the start of a recovery, if we're kind of on hold, because there's a cyber forensic team working on it, we're perhaps doing that every 4 hours, and then bringing those systems back, and then over time, once systems are all back online, we're probably then holding semi frequent calls with both the cyber forensic team to bring them the systems that they need for forensic analysis, and then start planning the recovery back. And this kind of feeds back to the original point about a full recovery team. When you carry out a kind of simple recovery of a server or two, usually it goes pretty smoothly. When you carry out a full recovery of every system coming back from a ransomware incident, there are always issues that kind of crop up, and it might just be something like a particular server hasn't been restarted in a long time and needs to run updates, or it could be a compatibility issue. There's lots of things that need to be worked through. So it's the reason you have lots of people on this, so you can have someone troubleshooting an issue at one side and someone bringing a system back. Once you've got everything back, you then do testing with the IT team, make sure everything's working properly, and then throwing that out obviously to the wider user base and getting people up and functional again as quickly as you possibly can. At that point, you would think it's kind of take a deep breath and you're kind of out of the woods, but at this point, you then need to make sure that your recovered environment is protected, that it is backed up to somewhere else. If, let's take the example of an on-premises environment replicating into the public cloud, let's say you're recovering in Microsoft Azure, you then need to make sure that that particular Microsoft Azure availability zone is being replicated to somewhere else, so that if there is any kind of issue while you're working in that new production environment, that you are protected and you can recover that data too. And then lastly, failing back. So this is an interesting one too, because obviously you never plan for, or you can't plan for when an incident will happen, but you can plan for when that recovery will come back. And actually, we've done a number of different kinds of recoveries failing back for organizations. It might be that you choose to stay in Microsoft Azure, and that will be your production environment from there on. It might be that seems a good time to do a kind of full-on infrastructure upgrade and refresh everything that you've got on your production site, and then fail back to that. It kind of gives you some flexibility and some options as to kind of what you want to do at the end of this incident, to take some positives from the situation. And so I guess lastly, a kind of point I'd like to kind of finish on is that we said good backup is just as much about methodology as it is technology. Obviously, we talked early on about some of the technology features that really help in any kind of ransomware recovery, but we'd certainly like to stress that it's not all a technology solution. You need to have the processes in place to make all of that work too. And I'll apologize because I've actually run a little bit long today. I see we do have questions. I'm afraid we're not going to have time for it. I do always like to try to finish as close to on time as possible, but I promise we will respond to all of the questions individually. And this is our last webinar of the year, so it's a little bit early, but let me be the first person to wish everyone a happy Christmas, a happy New Year, and we will hopefully see you all again early in the new year. Thank you very much.